Good evening. I'm going to call the Planning Commission meeting to order. It's now 6:30 p.m. It is Thursday, December 7th, and we are located in the council chambers here at City Hall. Good evening. So the next item of business is roll call, and I'll start on my right tonight.
Excuse me, Matthew Petrich.
Eric Brooks.
Jane Garrison.
Shanna Collins.
Larry Crandall.
Nancy Anderson.
Roshino Farrell.
Excellent. Did I do that right? 6, no. Are we missing somebody? No. We're all here. I did that wrong. Okay, there are 7 of us tonight. Okay. Full commission, which is always good when we have 2 really big topics to talk about tonight. So the next item of business is the approval of the agenda. So is there any objection to approving the agenda this evening? No. Seeing none, the agenda is approved. The next item of business is the approval of the minutes of November 16th, 2017. Is there any objection to approving the minutes this evening? No? Okay, seeing no objections, the minutes from November 16th, 2017 are approved. And the next item of business is public comment. And this is the time for non-agenda public comment. So I would like to ask if there's anyone who wants to speak about either the housing strategy plan or the pro plan to please hold your comments for the end of the meeting. Otherwise, come on up. Is there anyone who'd like to speak on a non-agenda item? Susan Haas, it looks like. And just remember to state your name and address for the board.
Okay, thank you. My name is Susan Haas, and my address is 19524 Southeast 24th Place in Sammamish.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm really here as somebody who's interested in the preservation of Providence Heights campus, which is in Issaquah, but I have some curiosities about a place that has so much to do with Sammamish and how it can affect Sammamish so greatly, whether it's the forests that are there now. It's a 40-acre place, filtering water that would go to other places, into the groundwater, surface water, and other things. And I've been told that Providence Heights is the only fallout shelter in the area. The closest ones are Redmond and Kent and Bellevue. So it could be a really good public safety resource in this era of provocation. And the school district, as I understand it, has not condemned it to build schools there. It's only authorized itself to do that. So I'm with a new group called Preserve Providence Heights that is getting active as Sammamish Heritage Society moves and shifts to focus more on its projects in Sammamish. Just has their own priorities, and there is some overlap. The president of SHS is also a member of this new group. So, but I just have questions for you. Do you ever make formal opinion statements on things that affect Sammamish, such as adjacent properties like Providence Heights, or the pro plan, if there were arts that were accessible to the public there, or affordable housing that could be there in the future, do you make statements about how that would be great in furtherance of your plans, like Chapter 6 of the pro plan with the arts and cultural programming, or the open space and trails? I'm just curious if you ever try to influence how things unfold, and also if you ever have anything to do with annexation. Say you thought, oh, this would be really great in Sammamish instead of in Issaquah. I'm just curious what you do. I'm sorry, I'm really just learning about your commission.
Let me go ahead and answer.
Great, thanks.
Usually during public comment, it's just your opportunity to speak, so we don't generally engage in a dialogue. But I will, because you said you're just trying to learn about our commission. So the Planning Commission does not make land use decisions. So we don't generally have opinions on specific properties or even areas, or, we are pretty high level. We try to focus on policies. Like tonight, we'll be talking about the pro plan and the housing strategy update. So we'll sort of talk at a really high level about the type of housing that we'd like to see in the city. You can go ahead and turn it off, Kelly. And then, so those are the types of things we do. So it's really not appropriate for us to do that. I think it'd probably be more appropriate for you to address the city council if on that kind of topic.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your comment. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak on a non-agenda item tonight?
With the chair's indulgence, I just wanted to, hopefully all of us had the opportunity to read the information that Ms. Hildy sent out on the docket meeting that took place with the city council this Tuesday. And it was impressive that at 1 to 1:30, both staff and city council were pretty well focused and did a good job, even though they'd probably been up between 17 and 20 hours when you do the math. So if you do have a chance sometime to watch that, I just recommend it highly.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you, Ms. Hildy, for giving us that update. It's helpful. Okay, the next item of business will be new business. And the first item under new business tonight is the updates to the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space, or PRO plan. So Angela Fesser is here. She's the Director of Parks and Recreation, and she is going to be giving us a presentation on the PRO plan. My ideas for tonight are to listen to Angie, try to keep questions to a minimum. I'm okay with questions that are really, really important that you're just dying to have answered, but we only have about an hour tonight because we need to also do the housing strategy. So I'd really like to focus on some things in the PRO plan that I think the Planning Commission should have opinions on, such as lighting, the athletic fields, signage. I have a whole list. Hang on, just wait. Just so you can be thinking about this while we're getting the presentation. Signage and wayfinding, the athletic field lighting, the artificial turf. I want to talk about YMCA facility use for the public in certain very small cases, and trails and connectivity. So just thinking about those items, and hopefully we'll have a healthy discussion about that after we hear from Angie.
Chair Collins, if I can, I'd like to have a couple opening remarks in relation to the Parks Department proposal for the 2018 PRO plan. Good evening, everybody. My name is Doug McIntyre. I'm a senior planner with the Department of Community Development. You probably know me very well at this point, but usually I'm sitting over there. I feel like I might be a little bit upgraded right now at the podium. So Kelly, you might want to start my clock. Sorry, all joking aside. That was quick. That went really fast. Sorry, all joking aside. We do have a really good meeting tonight, I think, set up for us, both really substantive topics. There is a distinction that I think Chair Collins hit on pretty well leading into this. The Planning Commission has been involved in a couple different joint meetings with the Parks Commission, so I think that hopefully the Commission has a pretty good understanding of what the background is, as well as what the public outreach process was. I think that was a pretty hefty component of this updated PRO plan. So just to kind of tag on to what the chair has mentioned, I think the Planning Commission should approach this topic in a maybe a little bit more of a high-level approach. I think that as far as consistency with the comprehensive plan, that's a really big key component of what the Planning Commission will be looking at. And of course, the recommendation that will come out of the Planning Commission after the January 4th public hearing will be forwarded on to City Council for their review. So similar process, but a little bit different because this is coming from the Parks Department. So I just wanted to make a couple quick remarks. The other item I want to bring to your attention is that as Commissioner Crandall mentioned, on Tuesday, the City Council set the docket, and Kelly Hildy, our planning manager, had sent out an email to the Commission earlier today, just a brief kind of reminder of what happened, and hopefully you are already aware. One of the items that was docketed was a comp plan amendment for the pro plan. So we are going to, now that the docket is set formally, we're going to concurrently tag on the comp plan amendment to the review of the pro plan. So what that means is that when we come on January 4th, in that packet we will have some material showing you what exactly is going to be amended in the comp plan. That will help us streamline 2018. We have a pretty heavy workload entering 2018, so we're trying to look for efficiencies as much as possible. This is a really good one to save some meetings in the long run with the Commission and save some time. So we're going to do that concurrently. Keep that in mind. The hearing on the 4th will be for the pro plan, but we will also be taking testimony on the comp plan amendment. So I just want you all to know that. You will also forward a separate recommendation on the comp plan amendment to City Council. So if there are any quick questions about the process and what I've said tonight, I can answer those real quickly and then turn it over to Angie Fesser, our Director of Parks and Rec. But if there are none, I will just go ahead and sit down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McIntyre. Okay, the floor is yours.
All right, good evening. Thank you, Planning Commission, for hosting us this evening to review the pro plan. As Doug had mentioned earlier, we've had some joint meetings with the Parks Commission regarding this planning project, as well as a joint meeting with the City Council, if you remember way back, I believe, possibly in May. May 9th, there was one as well. So this is basically bringing forward to you what's known as draft number 2. The first draft was reviewed by staff and the public in an open house prior to this, and that feedback incorporated, and then the Parks and Recreation Commission reviewed it last night, and we're bringing it forward to you this evening, and those comments and feedback will be rolled in together for the third draft, which we'll be presenting to the council in January. But I'll get into the schedule a little bit more. So I just have a brief kind of a PowerPoint here to work through a couple of things, and then I think we'll kind of dive into the document at that point as well. So I just wanted to kind of review the approach tonight. It's a hefty document, 250 plus pages, so we don't need to go through every page, but we'll talk about how to best approach it, kind of the timeline of the entire project, some recent work and our next steps, and then we'll kind of dig into chapters that we want to focus on for tonight, and then I want to button it up at the end again with just kind of that comp plan amendment process and what we're looking at to do that. So tonight, basically we're asking the Planning Commission's review and taking a hard look at this document as how it fits in with the other city plans and planning documents. How does this work well within all the others, and how does it sit well for our vision for the Parks and Recreation system in our city? We want to kind of focus on kind of the broader concepts of the plan, the grammatical pieces, the smaller things. We can take care of a couple other ways. We've caught a lot of those already in our review last night. And we want to kind of focus on chapters 5 through 8. Those are kind of the meat of the document as related to the Planning Commission. I'll talk about that. But also I want to let you know that there's other ways to have some input here too. We would be available for meetings one-on-one next week. If there are some burning issues and desires to have conversations about this document, I am more than happy to sit down with Planning Commissioner and talk about that. And then also, if something kind of comes up after tonight, after discussion, and you process this a little bit more, if you have some thoughts, you're more than welcome to contact me or email me with your thoughts within a week. We'd like to kind of collect all of this with the consultant and start rolling it into the document. We do have a pretty tight timeline. We're shooting for the end of February to adopt this, but it takes a while to do the next couple steps that we have planned. So just a quick review. We started in February of this year. Did a lot of considerable amount of public involvement and engagement. You can kind of see the 5 different methods we used here and how that happened over the timeline of the project. We're currently right about here, just kind of wrapping up the draft plan for review. and looking at February 20 for adoption. We really emphasize community involvement in this plan. This is a very important plan right now, and considerable amount. We've had, at this time, more than, I think, 1,200 touches from residents on it, so we're really happy about that. So recent work, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a couple of drafts. The first one was reviewed by staff in October, as well as made available to the public, and we had an open house centered on that draft. And then the second draft was what you have in front of you, and the Parks and Recreation Commission has reviewed that over the last couple of weeks. They broke into small groups, actually, and took different chapters and really dove into each chapter and brought together general comments from the group and individuals, and we went through that for a couple hours last night. And then here tonight in front of you to go through it. Next time you'll see this will be on January 4, as Doug alluded to earlier, a public hearing to kind of set us up for the comp plan amendment. And then the steps after that will be the draft presentation to the council on the 16th of January. And then if need be, another touch base with the council on the 6th of February, and hopefully adoption on the 20th. With the fact that we have 4 new council members, we are also taking some time next week on December 12th to debrief the 4 new council-elect members about the PRO plan. So obviously this is a pretty big project for them to bite off in January, so we're going to help them out a little bit with getting them up to speed. Many of those folks as candidates did attend some of the public meetings and were involved, so they do have a working knowledge of the document, so that's encouraging. The reason we're kind of pushing hard on the deadline too is that in order to be eligible for state grant funding on a 2-year cycle, we need to submit by March 1, the adopted document. So that's our hard deadline. So like I alluded to earlier, I think there's some chapters we can really focus on tonight, but I want to kind of go over the chapters that we didn't really need to focus on tonight all that much and kind of why, but review them. So chapters 2, 3, and 4 were basically data collection. So the community profile, our demographics, you know, kind of the nuts and bolts of who we are here in Sammamish. Chapter 3 focused on kind of the methods of community engagement. What did we do? The stakeholder meetings, the open houses, the community survey, all of that, and details that out extensively. And then the 4th chapter is the inventory of our existing park system, and each park site was evaluated and documented, kind of what it offers, what the amenities are, some room for improvement, and things we need to quick fixes for some maintenance in there. So we're basically collecting the information about what does the community want, what do we have, and then when you kind of put those two together, what's the gap? And the gap is kind of the recommendations that we're going to talk about as a group. Now, chapter 9 is kind of the how we do it. So chapters 5 through 8 are kind of the what we need to do. Chapter 9 is how we're going to do it. That is basically our capital improvement plan. And that lays out projects and a timeline associated with those and the costs associated with those to support the recommendations found in the PRO plan. So what we're hoping to kind of focus on this evening and get input from the Planning Commission on are chapters 5 through 7, which are kind of the needs assessments, basically finding out what the gaps are, and then the recommendations to help start to alleviate some of those gaps. And we break those into the 3 chapters you see there: parks, open space, and facilities. And then the other side of the house is the recreation programming that we do. And then trails is significant enough that we broke it out into its own chapter. And I just want to make a quick note on that too. The reason we did that is the non-transportation, or the non-motorized, non-transportation plan, the non-motorized transportation plan that was slated for this last year was actually broken into 2 pieces, and the non-motorized component, the non-right-of-way component that is housed in the PRO plan here, and then the right-of-way component is housed in the transportation plan. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's why Trails has its own chapter, which is very exciting. And then also the goals and objectives in Chapter 8 are kind of just looking at another way of framework, of setting our goals, our roadmap, basically, to get to filling in those gaps. How do we do that? So what I kind of did was break this down a little bit into each of those chapters. I had some feedback from the Planning Commission leadership about possible discussion points, and Shannon already mentioned those a little bit earlier, but I kind of dropped them in as discussion points, but which we can get into. But I also want to hear from everybody else on the Planning Commission, their input and feedback. One thing that was brought up that I wanted to address was kind of the question about, well, what about human services, senior citizens, and veterans in this plan? We do kind of look at the approach of seniors as far as programming and offering services related to recreation programming for seniors. But we don't necessarily draw out human services or identify veterans in this plan. The good news about that, though, is the city is currently doing a health and human services needs assessment right now. That has been going on for the last 6 or 7 months and will wrap up probably March of next year. The even better news about that is I'm the project manager on that. So what is happening is going through that needs assessment, I'm learning about human services, senior needs, veteran needs of our community, and we're having a lot of epiphanies and meetings because recreation programming can tie into some of those and support those. So I'm pretty excited that I'm kind of working on both those projects and I can connect the dots really easily because I'm involved with both of those. So this, what we did decide though is that this Pro Plan needs to make a reference to that needs assessment. So we're going to incorporate that in our document to say, hey, take a look at the needs assessment as well as part of our consideration. So Chapter 5, as mentioned a little earlier, were a couple of topics, and these are just kind of conversation starters for this. So Shannon, why don't you go ahead and kind of share your thoughts? We'll start with athletic fields and kind of your questions or comments or things you see you'd like to be incorporated in this plan.
Okay. Hang on one second. I think rather than things that need to be incorporated, I wanted to say that I appreciated the way that the information was presented and that I agree with the recommendations to improve the signage and wayfinding. I like the part about making signs consistent, making it obvious that this is a City of Sammamish park versus a county park. I like all of those suggestions that were in, I think it's Chapter 5. So I would support all of those things and think they're very important. As far as, and I don't know if we should go one by one, but I'll just say everything I have to say and then we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the artificial turf, I wanted to bring that up because the Planning Commission is usually sort of against, new impervious surface. So I think that's, I won't say the Planning Commission, but typically we talk about trying to reduce impervious surfaces rather than making more of them. But I think in the case of artificial turf, and this is my opinion, that it is essential that we convert those fields to artificial turf so that we minimize fertilizer, mowing, sending all of that grass to the landfill, fertilizing, mowing. There were 3 of them that I'm trying to remember my third case. Oh, and the water that we are using. And with these drier months in the summer, I don't know how we can take care of natural turf in these conditions without sprinklers, which is something we haven't really had in the past. So I think that's essential. It's also essential to keep those fields operating at the highest capacity possible so that if at all possible, we don't have to build as many more, that we can sort of use what we have. And it's not that I'm not in support of building more, it's just that I want to use what we have to the greatest efficiency possible. So that's something that I thought was important and something that I'm glad to see in the plan. The lighting, I think, is also very important. I think that will be a controversial topic because nobody wants bright lights in their backyard, and I completely understand that. I'm hoping that the type of lights we're talking about are newer technology lights that can point in a certain direction and not be lighting up somebody's house in the back, that they really will focus on the field that needs the light. When it's 4:30 and I want to take my kids outside and it's dark, I think about how little anyone else can use outdoors without lights. And 4:30 is really early. You could have the lights on all the way till maybe 7:30 probably without really disrupting anyone. So I just thought that those points, I don't think those points need to be in the plan. I just think it's something we need to talk about, because you start putting things like lighting in a plan and people start to get upset about it. So I sort of wanted to hear how the other planning commissioners felt about that. So I'll stop there and then we can talk. Anyone?
I'd be happy to share my personal opinions on lighting and artificial turf. I appreciate that there is somewhat of a regional approach in this document. Our neighboring cities do have facilities, and I don't know that we necessarily need to replicate them here. I think the lighting issue is really has to be talked about explicitly. For the first time in the 40 years I've lived here, I was driving home the other day and I noticed these bright lights up on top of the plateau that may have always been there, but I saw them for the first time yesterday, and it was shocking to me. I mean, I don't think of our city as a brightly lighted place. It's supposed to be dark and quiet and safe. And so I'm concerned about pushing that too far, and maybe technology and more importantly, careful siting of these facilities actually will mitigate that to some extent. But I certainly don't want bright lights shining on me, and I have street lights outside my house, and I'm glad they're there because it makes for safety on the roadways. But at the same time, I have to pull my blinds down, which is probably the neighbors appreciate anyways. But the artificial turf, I don't know enough about really, other than the imperviousness of them to say much. I think when I think of recreation spaces, I want them to be as flexible as possible, and I'm not going to go have a picnic on an artificial turf field. But I hadn't really thought about it in the respect that if the sporting activities are focused in a smaller area and maybe earlier in the morning and later in the day, that makes up for some of this what I see as lost open space for more passive uses. And then finally, access for me is a really big issue. I live down near the Sammamish Trail, and that trail and the parking lots that have gone in down there have physically divided up my little community. Our houses are now actually divided by fences and paved spaces, and that is a problem how it's affected our community on one hand, and then there are. On the positive side, there are people who have access to these wonderful facilities. On the other side, we're starting to see people who have no business being down there. They're fabricating excuses to be driving down these driveways, and they're casing the place, quite frankly. And we're having to scare them off, and they're basically trespassing and seeing who's home. So parks in general, I think have two sides. There's this wonderful resource, but we have to be careful about where they are and what the negative consequences are of these things of drawing more people into communities that maybe didn't have public access before. Those are my issues.
Thank you.
Are you going to speak?
Go ahead, Jean.
I don't know if I'm ready.
We can always go back and forth.
I'm not very comfortable with artificial turf, but I have a neighbor who has 2 young children, and they like it. They like to play on it. They prefer it to grass, and I thought, oh, that's terrible. What's happening to us? So I think of the loss of topsoil. I'm a real environmentalist. I don't like to lose our open space to plastic, and I feel like some of these some of these sports fields with their lighting are almost have the impact of an industrial use, and I want them positioned in the community to reflect that, so that they don't impact with their parking lots, huge parking lots. I live by Beaver Lake Park, and sometimes the parking lot overflows so badly, and the streets fill up with cars, and it's a whole different ball game, so to speak. So I didn't come here prepared to talk about athletic fields. I came here to talk about the environment because I picked my favorite thing. The plan is so big, so but I'll put in my 2 cents worth on athletic fields.
Thank you, Jane. Any others?
Now, were there things that weren't included in this list in prioritization? In other words, the needs, parks, and open space. Did you incorporate every comment in your pro plan, every priority that was brought up? Or were there specific things left out of this because it didn't rise to a priority in the decision maker's eyes?
So the earlier chapters do delve into kind of the public process and what was heard through that engagement. So, and we obviously had, like I said earlier, a handful of methods that we collected information. One of the statistically valid survey that we conducted was probably weighted a touch more than, say, an open house where we had 25 people, because it was more representative of the community. We had, I believe, we had 2,000 surveys we sent out. We had a response rate of, I think, 850 responses. We had something like a double-digit response rate on that was higher than average. So it was quite reflective of the community. So when we did look at the input from the community, we did have some pieces that we did weight a touch heavier. When this was pulled through into the needs components, we couldn't obviously list everything. You have to kind of prioritize. So I guess to answer your question, yes, there are some things that were kind of left out just because you couldn't really list everything, and we focused on the priorities. So for example, we had, during one of the open houses, an ice rink. There was a group of people that came and did a lot of input regarding an ice rink. That didn't necessarily make the top of the list because it was, 40 or 50 people wrote down ice rink. So it's, when you look at that in comparison to 60,000 people, a representation of 60,000. We didn't have ice rink at all during the statistically valid survey. So we're not going to put ice rink up there with our other priorities. If that makes any sense, does that help?
Yes, it does. I mean, the list is exhaustive and resources are limited. So
Exactly.
I feel like personally the passive parks, the open natural areas make sense not only for our environment but fiscally, not impacting the city as much as having the manicured bushes and upkeep that's required. And I imagine in moving forward, those kinds of considerations come into play because not all this can be adopted by our city.
Right. Just as a little side note, we found interesting too, we just did the land acquisition strategy and plan and wrapped that up. And the priorities through that were open space, conservation and preservation, trail corridor, and water access. So the community is saying we want to spend our dollars on preservation and conservation as opposed to, say, the athletic fields that we're talking about right now. So we will be spending some of our resources in that capacity and reflecting the community's needs and priorities. So, yeah.
In picking, your favorite topic or your topic that, is of greatest interest to you, special needs is always a topic that is of interest to me, being a parent of a special needs teenager. So when I think of parks and the amount of times I've spent in parks in Sammamish with my child when he was that age, some of them are happy memories, some of them are not. So when I think particularly of our playgrounds, and I look at, for example, the playground that they've created at the Bellevue Downtown Park, where all of the equipment are accessible to special needs children. And as a result, equally to our typically developing children. And typically developing children don't even notice that that this is equipment that has been modified so that everybody can play together. And that there isn't a special needs section tucked over here that has maybe one thing, and then all the other normal children are over here. So I wonder if that's something when we are looking at our parks, and especially those playgrounds, that we're giving some attention to that issue. I know I have no idea what the figure is, but I know we have a lot of special needs children that live in Sammamish. And I think that they need to be given equal consideration when we're looking at updating our playground equipment and making sure that not just that they're ADA compliant, which I'm sure they are, but that we have a park that's enjoyable for all families. Like Pine Lake Park always sent like fear through my heart every time we went to Pine Lake Park, because we have one section over here and then we have the swings over there. And then there's a road going through it, which people still drive up and down. And trying to get my child, my special needs child, who would just bolt in a second, and my baby, and when he would bolt to the swings, and the other one wanted to be over here. So that park was always filled with dread for me. So we didn't go there very often. So that's just something when it looks at, when we're talking about recreation, that we think about that for a lot of special needs parents. And I wonder if they had been, special needs families had been consulted or talked to, or if they were part of the people who kind of gave you guys some feedback on parks, because I know that they're a small group maybe, and are maybe not always consulted because they don't necessarily have a guiding organization that you could go to and say, well, how do special needs families feel about such and such? Right. You'd really have to seek them out through maybe the school district or that kind of thing. So I always think about that. And then in terms of programming, and you kind of had mentioned it in this kind of sidebar, other project that you're involved in, that you're project manager of, human services. And I do think a lot about, because my son now is 17, and all his schoolmates who are all of the similar age, programming and, activities for teens with special needs. There's a lot of things going on for kids with special needs, but as they grow older, where do they go? So I always kind of think of that too. So those are my comments.
Thank you.
Eric, did you? Go ahead.
All right, so a few comments and maybe a question or two. So on the lighting, we talked about dark sky before when we were talking about other lighting, so I think it's important. And we also talked about the wavelength and the blue-white wavelength and that, so there's more layers to it, right? I think that need to be looked into. I think someone talked about non-structured play. I think we need to focus on that a little bit more too. I think it's actually proven scientifically it's better for children's development. So I think we need to recognize that. I also saw an article on TV where there's doctors that are prescribing outdoor. It's called Park RX, and they're actually prescribing time outdoor instead of drugs. So kids gardening and all these types of things. It's proven that it's incredibly helpful for children and, well, everyone's health. So we kind of have our own growing drugstore around here that we could probably, capitalize on somehow. Maybe, I don't know how that would work. Special needs was something that I had on my list, and stuff for seniors, making sure trails or even little kids like toddlers, right? They kind of have the same mobility challenges. So I think that would be good. And the ages of these individuals using these facilities are going to ebb and flow, and it's going to be young kids at first, and they grow to teenagers, and it's going to be all over the place. I think understanding that nature. And then I had a question about, and it's kind of comes off of yours, Nancy, but it's how thoroughly were the stakeholder comments addressed? So we talked about the public comment, but you had particular stakeholders
Right.
groups that you brought in, and how
Right.
thoroughly were their comments addressed in the pro plan?
Right. So Eric's referring to this, that we had 3 different stakeholder groups that we brought in, small groups, and interviewed: environmental, programming, and athletics. We're kind of loosely identified as those groups, and were brought in, and the consultant spent quite a bit of time with them. And those comments, the stakeholder meetings and interviews and focus group discussion was all documented and incorporated into this plan. It's in the appendices, documented in that as well. And just like the other methods that we collected, community engagement, those were all incorporated into the recommendations through here. So, yep.
I'll be brief, and I think what I'll do is type up some of my opinions more. They're not so much questions, but
Okay, great.
the one thing I wanted to bring up, because I was hearing it tonight, is there's a book out called The Nature Fix, subtitle, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. And that's kind of following along these lines. It's by Florence Williams. In her book, she actually talks about, for quite a while in history, veterans have come back and moved to Alaska and rural Montana and different places for these things. And it's, I hear this. The other thing is, it's, and I'll put this in writing, I guess, that it's, over the years, I have come to believe that parks and recreation are the same thing, one and the same, and that when you're standing in a grove of trees, you're recreating, and when you're on a gym floor, that's a park. And if you worry about that, I guess this isn't new, because they do call them ballparks. And that's about all I have.
Okay.
I'll get it in writing to you.
Thanks, Larry.
One thing I want to say, because I want to address Commissioner Petrich's comments a little bit about, having the nice, beautiful, passive, environmentally, friendly areas and not plastic artificial turf. And I completely understand that. I am an avid outdoors person. That's what I love about Sammamish, is that every day I can do something different. I ride my mountain bike at Duthie Hill and Soaring Eagle both once a week. I'm hiking on the Grand Ridge Trail. You can be at the YMCA, and on Sundays, even if you're not a member, you can go and bring your kids and be there for a whole hour. We have trails, we have parks, we have swimming areas. We have so many wonderful things to offer. I think the Pro Plan is really about just kind of gathering up all those things and making sure there are all those opportunities. And, Eric mentions the unstructured play, and that is crucial, absolutely crucial. And we have Big Rock Park, which is a very cool place to visit if you haven't visited yet. They have these huge logs that kids can stack on top of each other and make these neat towers. I've visited every single park in the city with my kids. Everyone is different, and every park offers something different. And I think that's what's important. And even though we don't want lighting, we don't want plastic turf, we still need to provide that variety. And so that's what I think is really important, and that's what I really appreciate about the plan, is that it does capture that variety. It talks about the East Lake Sammamish plan, which one thing I did want to point out and say is that, the Pro Plan makes a lot of recommendations about things like signage and just very specific programming needs. And I think it needs to say somewhere in there that we intend to finish the East Lake Sammamish Trail, and that becomes a viable way for people to commute on that trail. And so I think that that's something very important for our community. So those are some of the other things that come into my mind as we're talking. So we can just kind of keep up this discussion if it's okay with everybody else, and if it's okay with Angie, as long as, I mean, we still have about 15 minutes. So I know Commissioner Garrison had some things that she wanted to talk about. So.
All right. As I said, we were told by the staff that it was an awfully big document, so we should pick something. So I did. I picked the environmental considerations. I think, first of all, I want to say this is just an incredible document, and it's so thorough, and you did the hard part of working with all these different groups, and I think that is just amazing. I think that's the hardest thing to do, and so I commend you for that and your group. So I wanted to say something that was helpful and not just derogatory. I would like to see a better distinction expressed in the plan between open space to be used for recreation and open space to be preserved for habitat and for the environment. And I was trying to think how you would approach this, and to me, I can see it in the drainage subbasin map on EC 10 of the comp plan. And if you could incorporate that into the maps of the parks pro plan, I think you would really have something usable. There are setbacks associated with those creeks and with that drainage that could also be incorporated, and there are also HOA properties that need to be emphasized that start to set up a pattern in plan view that could really help us with the rest of our community planning. To me, this open space plan and the parks plan could be a basis, it could be a rationale for how the rest of the housing and planning goes together. Right now, I'm at a loss when I see something like this, this little, who was that guy came in with he wanted his land divided right next to the park there.
But Ebright.
Right next to Ebright Park. He wanted, and here's this hole kind of in there that's zoned R1. Why? Maybe there's a good reason, but I don't know the reason. And if we had a plan that had a rationale behind the pattern, I could start to put it together and it would make things work for me. And I think it would help everybody, but maybe I'm wrong about that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I was very excited about the green streets and the small scale linkages between neighborhoods. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to be on the Planning Commission. And I'm disappointed that it's separated from the transportation plan, and that can't all be linked together, because I think there's something there that could happen as well. So those are my positive, trying to be positive and helpful suggestions.
Right, right.
Very good. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I share Jane's comment as far as recognizing the amount of work that you guys put into this. It's a lot of work, and you're not quite done, right?
Right.
I don't know how uncommon it is for in the city of Sammamish for parks to be kind of the major spearheader of cultural and historic preservation, and so I don't know how often other communities, if it's structured that way, and there's just the slightest hint of that in this document, and I think it could be a lot more strong. And maybe the consultant helping you guys putting this stuff together is not used to that scenario that we might have unique to the city of Sammamish. So I think the next pass needs to be kind of looked at through that lens, and really kind of try to pick out, there's so much place in there. There's places where parks and open space and stormwater and preservation, you know, a lot of these old places have big open spaces around them, so there's this nexus where we can achieve multiple things. But again, going back to, I think we need to recognize the fact that Parks has a big spearhead on the historic preservation in the city. Thank you again.
Nancy, Rosie, you guys have anything? No? You guys- Roshi?
Well, I just kind of want to echo what Jane said about linking this plan with the transportation plan. I think that's a really, really important point when we're talking about trails and connectivity and non-motorized trails. And seems like there's huge overlap between the pro plan and the transportation plan. And it would be really nice if somehow they get connected with their language and with the perspective that they're all coming from. I think that's something that would be a huge help to the city. And anytime we have any of our plans that overlap, which all of them overlap each other anyway, because we're all people and we have multiple facets to our lives. So I think that's a really important point, that if there is overlap in these plans, that the language and that their goals are running in the same direction and that they support each other.
Yeah, if I may comment on that, that was the intent. Even though the plan was broke apart, it was more so that it could be completed in a timely manner. And we're ahead of the curve. We're way ahead of the transportation plan. So we know that we're going to be talking to them as they develop and making sure that these two plans talk to each other really well. In the trails portion, we'll have on-street connections identified. So a good example is Beaver Lake Park up to Beaver Lake Preserve. We really need a strong connection, and the roadways the way to get there. So we identify that in the trails component and make it a higher priority. That obviously we wouldn't be building anything in the right-of-way, but that will be communicated to the transportation plan as a priority from us, and hopefully it'll show on their plan as a priority. It'll be a piece of input for them as well. So we're connecting some of those dots and using that. If we have to use the road system for connectivity, we've identified that in the trails component, and we're going to have that talk to the transportation plan. Yeah.
Angie, I was wondering if you could, when we talked on the phone, we talked about some of the examples of the YMCA sort of opening up its doors to the public so that you know, the entire public can enjoy the facility.
Right. So I'm just going to take a couple steps back and give a little bit of history about the community center, the Sammamish Aquatics and Community Centers, the building right here. It's a partnership with the YMCA in that the city resources helped construct that and build that, a lot of community input. But the Y is our partner in operating that facility. So it's a really unique partnership that is a model that's actually starting to be used in other communities. But part of the agreement we have with the Y is that we wanted that to function as a community center, not just as a YMCA. So we're focused on saying the community center rather than the Y here at the city. We're trying to get other folks to do the same. But part of the agreement was we wanted it to have community center elements to it, that it functioned as a community center. So some of the part of the agreement that we have with the YMCA is that there are free and available opportunities for community residents to use the facilities. So one example are the Sunday afternoon community swims that are available to anybody and everybody in the community. And so a lot of families do attend that, and they have huge attendance on that, which I believe Shanna can attest to. They have monthly senior socials during the middle of the day that are open to any of the residents, and they provide community events free to the public. Their Easter egg hunt called Extravaganza has several thousand children of all ages in this area here, and that's provided by the Y. So there's a community event provided by the Y, as well as the Boo Bash, which is kind of a Halloween themed activity that they open the facility for community members. There's also some other advantages that the 2 meeting rooms that are available in the Y are open for reservations for any resident or group in the community for free. They just have to reserve it and they can use that. And then also there's 75% discount of joining fees for people who join, as well as 10% off of youth classes and programs for residents as well. And I believe the first 18 months, the joining fee was waived as well. So those are some of the advantages. The Y has exceeded all expectations. The membership was through the roof and has been quite successful. They've realized that they have kind of hit their limit as far as programming based on facility availability, and they have actually joined in with, they have a sublease at Central Washington University for the gym and stage area at that facility to run their programs there as well. So the YMCA will be programming that to provide community activities there as well. So, and they're also in the schools. They offer programs through the schools. So that's an example. The city recreation programming philosophy is to provide indirectly the services. So we're not necessarily a traditional city model where we provide day camps and provide direct programming per se. The philosophy is that the community groups and partners will provide those, and what we do is kind of provides the facilities. So examples are the community center, the teen center, the recreation center, which houses the Boys and Girls Club, is in there, and as well as the Central Washington University is owned by the city, but provides programs for the community. So it's kind of a different model than most traditional cities. So those are some of the examples of that.
Thank you. And you mentioned the Boys and Girls Club and the Teen Center there. And on Monday night, when we had our joint meeting with City Council, it seemed that that facility may be disappearing in the very near future. It sounded like the lease was going to be up in 2 years. And I
Right.
never heard that it was that definite, but it sounded more definite than I had expected at that meeting. And so I want to talk about that because the Pro Plan doesn't really address a replacement facility for that. And I don't know if it needs to, but
Right.
that's just something that I've been thinking of since Monday.
Right. So there's a 40-year lease with the Boys and Girls Club for that facility. That was an old King County library that was improved to kind of create as a teen and recreation center, and then the Boys and Girls come in and operate that. Their first piece of their lease is up, I believe, in 3 years, and then it goes in 10-year increments after that to renew on that. It has been put on the docket for rezoning. We really haven't had much discussion in the Parks and Recreation Department about that facility and the future use of that. I'm just going to kind of put that as delicately as possible. That's been driven by the city, I think, to rezone it for what intention, I'm not entirely sure. I've heard a council member to talk about possibly selling the facility, but that's as far as it's gone at this point. We're moving forward as is and having the Boys and Girls Club in there and providing recreational opportunities through that facility for our community in one way or another.
Okay, thank you.
One last thing, but Director of Parks and Recreation brought it up. Under your subtitle, the Human Services, I believe that the community center is designated a safe place.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
And I just see so much connectivity there. That's great.
Yeah.
Any others? Yeah.
Yeah, one other comment as we were talking about the community center. When the YMCA was in the Providence Point, we found it as a family easier to find time to get in to swim, and it was much more economical. So I think we need to kind of keep an eye on what these costs are for, the public, because some of us are struggling to live in the city financially, and so we need to kind of recognize that too, if we can, to the degree we can. So thank you.
Right. If I may comment on that, the fees for the Y are set by the organization itself, the Greater YMCA of Seattle. So, in our agreement that we have with the Y doesn't get into detail about the membership fees or amounts in that. So, but there could be some conversation about that in the future. Also, though, nobody is turned away from the YMCA if they are unable to pay for membership or registration. They have a very robust scholarship program and financial assistance program, so nobody will be turned away for that reason.
But I do agree with Commissioner Brooks wholeheartedly, and I think that's my reason for advocating for opening the YMCA to the public. And the swim time in the future, it'd be neat to see, a Zumba or yoga for teens. The recreation services should be providing programming that people that can't afford to pay for it in the private sector can participate in. So I think if that's all the comments, I do have one question about the next time we see you, which will be on January 4th, and it will be the public hearing. At that time, what will you be asking us to do? Just completely wholesale approve it? I think that's
Doug.
probably
Yeah.
what you're... and what will
So-
be the structure? I mean, what sort of input will you be looking for at that point from us?
So this draft will incorporate comments collected tonight as well as from the Parks Commission last night, and that'll be a more complete draft. And that's what we'll be kind of presenting to you, and a public hearing will be open for that, for both recommendation to the council by the Planning Commission for the document, as well as setting it for the comp plan amendment. So I'm going to probably turn that over to Doug, so.
Yeah, there's not much to add to that. That is essentially
that's
what
it.
we're looking for the Planning Commission to do, is to provide a recommendation to forward to City Council for the pro plan, as well as separately and concurrently the comprehensive plan amendment that was docketed on Tuesday.
Okay. More specifically, and I'm not hammering on lighting because it's just one of those things that I'm thinking, is it our place to look at the document and say, we're not interested in the athletic fields, remove it? Is that the kind of thing we're looking to the Planning Commission to give direction? Or is it more just sort of holistically accept what is here and move on?
Right.
That's
so-
kind of what I'm...
Right.
Are we trying to remove or add certain things, or are we just...
Right.
Yeah, I think you know what I mean.
So the Parks Commission had the same comment last night, and what I would recommend is if the Planning Commission has some strong recommendations on material in here that maybe, let's say lighting, if you don't necessarily agree with lighting, that you can pass on your recommendation with the caveat about, we don't necessarily support lighting at a lot of fields, or something that you can make your opinion heard, and then the council can take that into consideration when they go to adopt the document. And if they want to change the document at that time to reflect that they could. So the Parks Commission has a couple items like that as well that they want to forward to them. So they're basically saying, here's the plan, a couple of things we wish you to consider changing in the plan. So, yeah.
Okay, so I do want the commission to be aware of that, and for the January 4th meeting, if you feel strongly about any item in the pro plan, that we address those items at the meeting, and so that everybody feels like they got to really put their teeth into it, and that we can include any of those comments in the memo to the City Council so that they know our position and where we stand.
So is it deliberation? It's not really deliberation.
That's kind of what I'm asking. Is it a deliberation, or is it is it like we're going to have a main motion to accept the plan, and then if someone wants to make amendment, we would say I would amend the plan to eliminate the recommendation to have athletic fields? Is it that specific?
So I think that's up to the commission in many regards, but the commission will open the public hearing similar to how we always do. Open it, take testimony, close the hearing, deliberate, and then as forward a recommendation as is fit for the commission. So I think it wouldn't necessarily deviate from any procedures that we have typically followed. It's just, I guess the point that going back to what I made earlier is just that this particular document is slightly different than what the commission is used to reviewing. It isn't originated from the Department of Community Development. So I think we would urge you with regard to taking a look at this plan, think in a more holistic sense as it relates to the vision for Sammamish and the consistency with the comprehensive plan. That those kinds of items I think are pertinent here as well.
I wholeheartedly support the plan as is. I really just want the commission and the commissioners to feel that if there's something they really feel strongly about, that they make it known and that we address those things and that we get those comments to City Council also. So I just want everybody to know that so that you feel comfortable with that. Okay, and if there's nothing else, then we'll move to the other topic tonight. Is everybody good? Oh.
Would the chair entertain a 5-minute recess as we segue between open space and closed space?
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mrs. Fesher.
Yeah,
I really
thank you very
appreciate
much,
it.
you guys. Appreciate it. See you soon. Yeah. See you next year.
And the next. Stop this. Okay, we're going to come back to session because we do still have a pretty big topic to cover tonight. And that's our housing strategy update. So this evening, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McIntyre, who will be giving the presentation.
Thank you, Chair Collins, members of the Planning Commission. I am Doug McIntyre, Senior Planner with the Department of Community Development. Don't get confused that I'm sitting here now, just all kinds of craziness today. To my left is Arthur Sullivan. He is the program manager for a regional coalition for housing. And to my right is Mike Stenger. He is not at the staff table, but he is a planner with Arch as well. They are going to be assisting the city in the update of the housing strategy plan. So they will be integral to this process as well as city staff. So the last time we talked about housing strategy was back in September. It's been roughly 3 months, so hopefully you haven't forgotten everything about it. But if you have, don't worry because I have a little bit of a refresher. I'm going to run through some of the old slides as well as some new slides. Most of my presentation will focus on laying the foundation for some of the elements that Arthur will cover in more detail. I do want to remind the Planning Commission that our long-term purpose with the housing strategy is to update the old 2006 housing strategy plan. There's been a lot that has changed since then. We want to make sure we're consistent in implementing our housing policy for the city of Sammamish. Tonight, however, we have two specific tasks, and I apologize, one of those is actually left off of this sentence right here, but we will be asking at the end of the presentation for very specific input from the Planning Commission on what type of data does the Planning Commission want to see with regard to housing, and how can that help to inform the discussions that we're going to have on the housing strategy. I think that's going to be pretty critical as we start moving forward into the substance of this. As you may recall, this is going to be pretty much a Planning Commission driven document as far as what direction are we going. We're going to be doing some significant outreach as well, which is the second question I want to ask of the Planning Commission tonight is, what types of outreach do you think that we might want to engage in with the community and stakeholders throughout Sammamish? So keep those things in the back of your mind as we talk about these elements of the housing strategy plan. We will hopefully get some pretty specific input from you all. And of course, if you think of anything afterwards, you can feel free to call or email us as necessary. So again, I've hinted at this, but you will be ultimately providing some pretty substantive policy input. We are talking about something that's completely different than what Planning Commission has talked about in recent meetings. So for instance, the comprehensive plan docket. which was our last meeting. That was more of kind of like a regular city business type of item. And this is going to be more of a substantive document. So again, keep that in mind as we go forward with this presentation and future presentations. So high-level overview, we've, again, kind of set the foundation for the housing strategy plan at our September meeting. If you recall, we did an exercise where we asked the commissioners what are some household types that we see in Sammamish. We also talked about who are the major players in housing, and you provided input, and we will actually provide a little bit of a report back on that tonight. Arthur will take care of that and kind of talk about what that means as we move forward. Tonight, we're going to continue to build that foundation. We will really be setting the stage for the substantive work in 2018. We're going to meet several times, plenty of times, I guess I should say, in 2018 to get to a draft plan that will ultimately forward to City Council. So again, that's going to be the bulk of, I guess, the meat and potatoes or meat of it. And then, yeah, so I will start at the beginning here. I had this slide on the last presentation, but I like to just, for folks who are watching at home and members of the public, of course, the planning commissioners have this in their packet, but if you want to look at it online, it's pretty easy to find. You go to our city website and you look for our comprehensive plan, which is linked on the community development webpage. And in volume 2 of the comprehensive plan under housing is where you'll find the housing strategy plan. It begins on page H77. And the reason for that is that there are other parts of the housing element, one of which is the housing needs assessment, which parts of it are excerpted in your packet today. And where does this really kind of generate from? Well, we have specific policy language in our comprehensive plan that tells us that we need to adopt a housing strategy plan. It's our policy framework, it's our work program, it's the way that we start to implement our housing effort for Sammamish. One distinction is that it is actually not an action plan. An action plan has more of a kind of sequential steps that you take to an ultimate goal. This is a little bit different in that it's, again, more about that framework. What are some efforts that we could undertake to address housing in Sammamish? So what do the housing policies and the housing element tell us? Well, it focuses on a few different things. A lot of those are actually reflected in the current housing strategy plan, which is a good thing for that consistency reason. But some of the big elements of it are, for instance, affordability. Housing affordability has been a problem and will continue to be a problem for not just Sammamish, but the region. It's something that affects everybody. It's not just one segment of the population, it is everybody. The housing element also talks about character, which is a very complex goal to have, but it's very important. We've touched on neighborhood character in past meetings, and as you may recall, it is, again, a very complex issue. It's not just one solution that solves everything. It's a multitude of issues. Our housing element also talks about capacity for dwelling units, and one of the things that we note in there is that we do have the current capacity to meet our growth targets. Our growth targets are driven by population growth, and it kind of cycles through a county-wide process, and all cities within King County and within all growth management planning cities get a growth target. So we are able to accommodate the growth target we've been given. That growth target is 4,640 dwelling units, as is noted on the slide, and that's talking about all housing. The other major component of our housing element is to take a regional approach, and part of that is what we're doing tonight with having members of ARCH with us. They take an approach of the East King County cities. So again, thinking more broadly than just Sammamish, because housing affects all cities. It's important to all cities in the region. Supply of housing is also a very important part of our housing element, particularly with regard to a diversity of housing supply. As you all know, Sammamish has a relative monoculture of housing, many single-family detached homes. That may fit the needs of the community now, but if we start thinking down the road, maybe 30, 40 years, does that make sense for a changing demographic? We want to look at that. And then, of course, town center is a major component of how we meet that future housing supply. It's emerging. It's not quite there yet. We're still kind of in the early stages of town center, but it's an important part of that. And then the housing element is also important because it has data. And what that data says is basically that Sammamish has some pretty expensive housing. It's actually 55% higher than the countywide average. That tells us something. That's one part of this equation. 3 of 10 households are considered cost burden. So what that means is the household is spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And that, again, affects not just low income, it affects everybody. It's a metric for all households. And then talking about value again, median home value, if you look at that graph on the bottom of the slide, in 2017, this is data from Zillow, so take that with a grain of salt. But for 2017, the median home value was $900,000, and it's projected to increase by roughly 5.5% to $950,000 by 2018. So, again, take that with a grain of salt, but it's another metric to consider. And then when we talk about a jobs to housing balance, we realize that an ideal balance might be one where there's an equilibrium in housing and jobs. Sammamish is actually low on that low side of the ratio, 0.3 jobs to dwelling unit. So that's something that, again, part of this equation we need to look at. And then Sammamish, as you may well know, has a relatively high percentage of home ownership at 90%. So that's higher than countywide averages. So what does this all mean? Why are we considering a housing strategy plan update? Well, there's 3 main reasons with some kind of sub-reasons to that. One is that there's a new policy framework. We, as mentioned before, adopted a housing strategy plan in 2006. We've made a lot of progress since then. However, it's time to take a look at it. It's been a while. There's been a recession in between there. There's been a lot that has changed. The comprehensive plan itself was updated in 2015, and then our housing element was subsequently amended in response to a Growth Management Hearings Board order in 2016. If you recall, at the end of last year, we did that effort. So there's a change in the policy framework. The other main category is external factors, things that the city can't control. So one of those, as you well know, is a historically strong market, changing demographics, changing preferences. Newer generations might be looking at different types of housing. So that's something to consider. You will probably also know by way of just anecdotes or news articles that there's a lot of growth. Lots of growth happening. Whether we like it or not, we are dealing with growth, and that will drive a lot of really difficult conversations about housing, both locally, regionally, and it affects how we approach our policy. And the final category is just maintaining consistency and really focusing on implementation. So we want to match our housing policy with our housing need. We want to have some short-range strategies, and we want to address our emerging town center. I kind of skipped ahead a little bit on this, but you all may know the FYI guy in Seattle Times, Gene Balk, I believe his name is. He focuses on growth and changing demographics almost weekly, I think. And this is a recent article, and the point of this graph is showing that we're dealing with a lot of new folks from out of state. So there's people migrating to this area. There is just natural population increase, and there's all kinds of other factors here. So we're breaking records all the time. And again, this is the reality of the situation, whether we like it or not. And then this is some data from the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is our multi-county, it's our metropolitan planning organization. They have a lot of really great data. If you haven't perused their site, I'd recommend it. They are data-driven, but they also take a regional approach, which is helpful. So I apologize, it's a little bit hard to read. The point here being that prices are increasing, both sales and rent. So we're dealing with some historic increases here. And data will come again later in this process for updating, but these are just trying to set the stage for what we're talking about. So how does it all come together? We are going to be updating the strategies. That's, again, our work program for how we can begin to implement our housing policy. It's a mix of short-range strategies, both incentive-wise, kind of indirect, direct, and land use is regulatory. So there's a lot of considerations here. The good thing is that we are not starting from scratch. We have a plan that has done a lot of good for the city. So that's something that we should be using as kind of a diving board, I guess. And then again, just to reemphasize, Planning Commission will be playing a major role in the development of this. This is somewhat different than what you've dealt with in the past. Again, if you think about maybe the code updates to drainage, to Title 13, or if you think about the comprehensive plan docket, this is a very different animal. So just please don't lose sight of that. So now I will respectfully turn it over to Arthur Sullivan, who
Actually,
will...
Doug, before you break with this, I want to be really clear. We're not redoing the housing element portion of the comprehensive plan. We're just doing this matrix document.
Right.
This is what we'll be focused on.
Right, I kind of skipped a step there, sorry. Our housing element is not being updated. The housing element was updated at the end of last year. This is an implementing action of the housing element. The keys are the strategies and then the relative priorities for those strategies.
It's like we will use the policies in the element to update this matrix of
Absolutely.
the housing strategy plan.
Yes, thank you for clarifying.
Okay, and it's just the housing strategy plan. There's no introduction, there are no policies, goals, anything. It's just this document.
It's the strategies,
Okay.
yeah. It is hopefully pretty clean cut.
And then what about, like the previous city housing efforts? Will we dive into that at all? Will we update that document? Because that's kind of a neat document.
Yeah, that's actually meant more to summarize for your purposes, just to understand what we've done under the existing housing strategy plan. So that's what we've accomplished, I guess.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions like that? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you. So to your just most recent question, one of the things that you'll, as we go through this, decide what other information you want to include with the matrix that helps show your work, or what was the basis. And for other cities, often, a number of cities are doing similar exercises as you're going through. And whether or not you want to include some summary of what the city has been doing or some of the demographic data and stuff, that will be something we'll talk with you to feel how much of that kind of supplemental information you want to come along with the actual strategy in the end. Okay, so, and just to sort of reiterate Doug's points about what is the housing strategy, is that your housing element and the policies that are in there imply a really wide range of things you could do to help implement those. And if you've looked through your housing strategy, you sort of listed what all those. We can't do all of those all at once. And so the whole challenge is to say, here are policies, here are all these strategies. Which are the ones in the next 3 to 5 years should we focus on? You're not trying to come up with the answer when you write the housing strategy. You're trying to decide which are the strategies and actions you may take over the next 3 to 5 years, so that you can have what you think are most related to your policies and the conditions that you see today. And the whole idea is that after 5 years, you look back at what you've achieved. So part of, I think, of what you should be doing here is looking back at what you have achieved the last 5 years, and then look at current data and say, now, do we keep working on some of the high priorities from before, or do we shift to some new ones? But that's what this exercise is. It's about deciding what is your work program amongst a wide range of potential actions that you think are most effective in dealing with your housing policies and the needs in your community. Is there any questions about that before I sort of go back to the future a little bit here? At the last meeting, when we talked on this topic, I sort of talked with you, not so much about what you've done or anything, but how do I look at housing often when I'm working with the community? And I'll also add, Doug made the comment that Arch has sort of East King County perspective, that we're aware of what's going on in the East King County. But tonight, I'm your staff. I am City of Sammamish staff. And ARCH is a public entity created by the cities on the east side, and just sort of to remind you of that. And it was formed because the cities realized there's a lot of similarity and issues amongst many of the cities on the east side. And therefore, if they had a staff to share, they would be able to have specialized staff to help each city work on their individual areas. So while we may have worked on topics in other cities, we don't come in professing this is what you should do. We're here to take the experience of issues that we've worked on with you and with other cities to help you as the city works on its specific areas of activity. Okay, so that's something I just want to emphasize for you. So at the last meeting, I've been doing this kind of work for a long time, is to sort of ground you in sort of starting to think about from a city point of view, because you're doing a city housing strategy, and a lot of housing isn't done by the city directly, but you have impacts on it. So this first graphic was to say, well, housing is basically serving people of your community. And what you helped me do, we went through an exercise of describing different kinds of households in your community. And those are what are listed on this graphic that you have here. And you can see there's a wide range of different types of households. We then went across and said, we didn't fill in the numbers, we said, now, for every one of those types of households, there would be people at different income levels. And basically, in an ideal housing world, you would have a supply of housing in your community that from a type of housing and a cost of housing would match up with the demographics of your community. And so the point of this was just to sort of give you a sense of, and your policies reflect this a lot, of the wide range of different kinds of needs in your community and the kind of things you may want to, we're going to come back at a future meeting with more data. We've given you some of that data material, but we want to spend an evening really talking with you and having you talk about what you see are needs in your community. And those needs might be people who are here today or people who aren't here, like employees who might want to be here, but it's hard for them to afford to be here. So this was just meant to be an exercise to sort of open your minds to the wide range of different kinds of needs that you might be trying to focus strategies on. And then we did add some information here that shows within King County, within East King County, the far right column, how many people there are from census data in some of those categories, and then compared that to data for Sammamish. And we'll come back and visit. This was meant to be just sort of set up information for you. The next slide here is where we talked about all the steps involved with creating housing and all the different players who impact what housing is all about or what housing ends up being in the community. And it's all the more obvious things we think about, which is, well, there's a developer and there's a contractor, there's an architect and bankers, but there's also the city as a regulator and what they allow to be built in the community. There's also, or what they allow to be permitted, and sometimes cities get in the role of regulating. They might have things about tenant protections. You probably have read about that in Seattle, where they're looking at a lot of issues related to tenant protections. Some cities are doing things like rental inspection to make sure they're maintained at a certain quality, of level of quality. So that's for the regulator. But then there's these other roles, which are property management and neighbors and community who show up and comment about what the plans allow. But it's also the people who are going to live in the housing. And what we tried to show you is that there are different, across the top, are different kinds of housing that are created that deal with different needs. And the most common is market rate housing. And then there's areas that I'm going to talk more about tonight where the city gets to have more and more of a role of impacting that housing on the far right, public housing that you think of, where the federal government literally finances it, builds it, manages it. It's all publicly operated. And the point that we're showing you with the green shading is that different efforts that cities involve themselves in can vary. It's not all one or the other. You can find different ways and sort of being a player in the financing arena or you're a landowner arena, but there's different ways in which local government can be involved in impacting housing in their community, and everywhere from market rate housing to more directly assisted housing. So that was the purpose of these slides, is to just give you a sense of what we're trying to address from a common sense point of view, and then second, what are the different kind of ways cities can be involved in different kinds of housing. So any questions or thoughts that you have from that last conversation on this topic before I then start talking a little bit more about different strategies cities can think about using? Okay. So go right to the next slide, I guess. This is the housing strategy, and again, just a reminder of the format at this point of what is in the housing strategy. And this is one of the pages from the existing strategies, and what you will see here is we have organized the strategies around several categories, which I will come back to in a minute. And under each of those basic categories, there are then a number, as you see these numbered ideas, and under this particular page we did, the broad categories were ADUs, mixed-use design standards, and incentives to expand housing choice. And under each of those, there are several even more precise ideas or strategies that relate to those issues. Like with ADUs, it could be as much about what your permit and your land use regulations say, but it might be how much you charge to get a permit. Or it could be how do you educate the public about what they can do. So the idea is we kind of have this long list of different ideas. You have a list to start from. You can add more if you have, we'll have a part where we'll say, are there other ideas? You'll notice at the end of each one, this gets to one of the earlier questions, that there are numbers in parentheses. Those are the housing element policies from the old housing element. Did we update those? I don't think we have yet. But that correlated so that you can see which strategies are helping to implement which policies in your housing element. So this is one of the exercises we go through, is let you know this policy or this strategy affects these policies. And then what we do in the end, we go back through your whole housing element and say, do we not have strategies for some of your policies? So we try to make sure through this exercise there are different strategies to address all of your policies. Oh, no, go back. So then the other is this chart here shows you the next couple columns are, is the action to implement it a land use, a regulatory type, or is it some other type of action that would probably be more of a direct council action? Then we also show what income level the strategy might address, what that housing, would it result in housing that's affordable to the general market or specific levels of affordability. Then finally, and this will be your exercise, is prioritizing them. Is something a higher priority, medium, or a low priority? And that sort of sets, and that's the main exercise that you eventually we want to get you to. So any questions about that format as you sort of reread that and sort of try to understand that material? Okay, so moving along. So the categories that we have listed under the strategy plan are neighborhood quality, types, variety, amount of housing. So that's where you're looking at how much housing is allowed and also the diversity and range of different types of housing. Then you start getting into strategies that result in what would lead to some explicit level of affordability. That can be either through direct means or indirect means, and we'll get back to that. And then you have a category on special needs housing. So that can be housing for seniors, people for disabilities, people who may have specialized needs, that there's some service level component that goes with the housing for the residents in there. And are you doing things to support that type of housing? And then regional efforts. Where do you fit into the region? Where are the ways in which you look into fitting into regional efforts? So those are the main categories. Any questions on those? Okay, moving along. And this is the same slide. And what we've done is just giving you some examples of things that fit into those different categories. So again, types and variety, allowing duplexes and cottages in single-family neighborhoods for variety. Reducing impact fees for housing that has affordability is an example of affordable housing. Supporting senior housing is under special needs. And then participating in countywide discussions related to like countywide planning policy. So those are some examples. Obviously, if you read through this housing strategy for each section, you'll see many other examples as well. Okay. So now, a little bit different way of looking when I look at city roles. This is sort of looking at, and this is what I'm going to spend most of my rest of my time here, sort of giving you examples of things you've done and other cities have been doing, and they generally have fallen into sort of three main categories, with the first being that diversity of housing, which is what are you doing to allow the market to meet needs? And what this chart is trying to show you is that market rate housing is generally serving people who are moderate income and above to some degree, depending on what your rules are. Your market rate housing, which is just what you generally allow, might start getting to the point it's affordable to moderate income levels. Then the other is when do you do, the second area is land use incentives, which is where you try to direct the private market to create explicit affordability. And then the third category is when does the city take the next step, where they get more directly involved in exchange and to create even greater affordability. And usually that is to achieve greater affordability levels than any of the first two groupings, okay? And so we find that our work generally falls into, the city's work fall in those three categories. And I think the next slide sort of says the same thing. So I'm going to now go through each of those three areas and give you some more explicit examples of what communities in East King County and Sammamish have done in those areas. And this is meant to be just sort of background and context for, and we'll be revisiting all of these in future meetings. So the first is the area of supply, diversity, and relative affordability. Things that are examples of that are allowing mixed-use housing, ADUs, cottage housing, and zero lot line. So I think we have slides for each of those. So mixed-use housing, you actually have images of, you're now a community that is starting to see development along those lines. When I came here 25 years ago, nobody in East King County had housing like this. And now, when we did this housing strategy, other cities on the east side were starting to see mixed-use housing. You were just starting to plan for it. You're now to a point with this update that, as you can see in East King County, as you drive around and go to other cities, many cities are increasing the amount of mixed-use housing. And mixed use, we mean ground floor retail and centers usually, or office space, upper floors residential. And you're now in your town center starting to see developments along those lines in your community. Another example is accessory dwelling units. This is where people use a portion of their existing homes, which is in the middle slide, or maybe expand their house, which is on the left, or maybe use part of a space that, like in a detached garage, to make small rental units. And this is an area that most of the communities in East King County allow, and different cities have seen different levels of results and different amounts of accessory dwelling units being created. Cottage housing, this is another thing that you've worked on since the last housing strategy. This is where you allow in single family areas smaller homes, and as a result of those homes being smaller, you allow more units than would typically have been allowed on that individual piece of land. The development that is using those provisions is the Habitat for Humanity project on 228th, about 10 blocks to the south of here. You may have seen that. That's under construction at this point in time. Other cities, I believe Redmond and Kirkland have also adopted provisions along those lines. Sometimes you see cottage housing where they're more clustered around a courtyard. We often see a development along those lines, and that's what we've seen in Kirkland. So
Can I ask a question about the cottage
Yes.
housing? Just a quick one. Is there a certain parameter of square footage? Is it to be under a certain square
Yes.
footage, a cottage?
Yes, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but yes, you have a square footage limit. Kirkland actually did two different square footage limits. One that's smaller and you're allowed to do like twice as many, and one that's sort of medium and you get to do 1.5 times as many. So they actually have two different size limit standards, kind of thing. So, and there's usually, some cities will do design standards, et cetera, that go along with those provisions as well. So,
Okay.
but yes, there is a size limit on the units.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then another is just allowing zero lot line or duplexes or even multiplexes in single family neighborhoods. So that's a little bit different than cottages. This is where units are actually attached. And these are a couple of different examples of different buildings that have done duplexes in East King County. And one of these is up in the Newport Hills area of Bellevue. And so I want to stop there for a second before I jump into the second category and see if you have any questions about this first, which is these are all scenarios where you allow through your land use regulations, but that's the city's basic role, is just by allowing, and then the market decides whether or not it will respond. There are other ideas. We just wanted to put a few out there tonight. If there's others in particular that you're curious about, or if you have any questions about these before I move on.
Can you explain zero lot line? What does that just mean? It's a house that has no garden, or it's attached to another house? It's a semi-detached unit. Is that what we mean by zero lot line?
Yeah, zero lot line is essentially a design feature where the interior setback can be 0 instead of, say, 5 per lot, which would mean effectively 10 feet between a house. This one would allow one of the homes to be built on the lot line. So it's a little bit denser, it's a different type of product, but it allows a little bit more flexibility to get greater density in certain
Okay,
areas.
so kind of like a townhouse situation, possibly.
Right, possibly.
Okay.
And what the distinguishment is at times, and what becomes important to builders at times, is you mentioned townhomes. You can have two buildings that look the same, like a townhouse configuration.
Right.
But one really is townhomes where each owner owns the land underneath them, and there's a separate parcel line, just like you can see in this sketch that you have in this diagram. And so everyone owns not only their building, but they own the ground underneath them separately. You can have other situations where it is technically more of a condominium, and in that case, there's single land ownership, and depending on how it's structured, and the building and the structure of the building is owned in common, and then you own your space, but you share the ownership of the land. And builders often like to be able to do the separation of land, title, have separate land ownership, and so that's why sometimes when you look at these, some cities have done provisions that are duplex, single ownership for the duplex, and others have allowed it to be able to be subdivided so that they're separate parcel ownership. Okay. Yes. Was there another?
I don't know if this is the right time. Just anything kind of, okay, so one thing that I think would be helpful for me on all of our presentations, having copies of these slides, just for future reference, I think would help jog
Okay.
my memory about things, later on. So,
Okay.
I see a lot of layers going on here. Like, for example, you talked about a job-house ratio. I can see how that could have directly impacts traffic, right? So that's a whole nother kind of thread floating out there. You're talking about land use regulations and how they can be used to influence housing choices. And I know that, a lot of our development standards, they don't have like minimum lot sizes or FARs, or seems to be a lot of work that we could do in our land use regulation to support this
Yes.
effort. When we start talking about some of these the last couple slides or two, it makes me think about these discussions we've had, 18 months ago or better, about bulk and these types of things that we have never really circled back to. So that stuff's still kind of lingering out there.
Okay.
And then, are we able to define what income level that our allocation will serve? So we're allocated X amount of housing units. Do we have any control over saying, all right, well, we're going to take X amount percent of that, it's going to be allocated to meet this income level, and this, can we do that?
So these are all great points, and we hope that by the time you're starting to prioritize, you will have enough chance to talk about exactly the points you're raising. Because yes, all of those things could be on the table. In fact, I think you would find almost all of those things are in the matrix.
Okay.
And the challenge for you is which ones sort to the top.
Right.
And so what we're hoping is in the first few meetings is to get you more and more familiar with I love the word you use, the threads that are out there when you start thinking about housing. It interlinks with transportation issues. It interlinks with so many different perspectives. And hopefully give you some time to think through those, all of you, and start to ground you enough to now sort through all that and do exactly the kind of thing you're describing.
Couple more quick questions. So what's the correlation between the SEPA definition of low, medium income, or low, medium, high income housing? Does it correlate to these income levels we're talking here? Are they totally different?
SEPA or the comp plan?
Yeah. Can you clarify when you say SEPA, are you talking about
State environmental policy?
review?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it depends on the proposal, but sometimes that could be incorporated into an environmental review. The affordability levels or the income levels are typically defined by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So that would be, for instance, 80% moderate, 50% low, and 30% very low. And those are percentages of the area median income, and that's based on a household size.
So that's not the same about SEPA. When they go in there on their housing section and they're talking about how many homes are going to be provided, are they low, medium, or high? When they report that, it has nothing to do with these income levels.
I think it's rooted in that, but I don't think it's explicitly
But it's not,
tied to
okay.
that.
And then
But-
one last thing, are ADUs currently allowed in the city?
They are, yes.
And how about DADU, or detached accessory dwelling units?
You allow both.
Both, okay.
Now,
Okay.
so and that point I would like to make is that's a good example to make another point for your consideration, which is when you're going through the strategies, you're not starting at the beginning. You do allow accessory dwelling units. You do allow, you created the town center plan, which has affordability. Not only did that diversify your housing, but it has affordability provisions. So when you're sorting through these, part of it, we will let you know what things you have worked on. You may say, let's go back and look at that one again because we want to get more results. Okay, so or we want to do a new thing. So when you're trying to sort things up, it can be we need to revisit something we've done, or it can be we want to do something new, or both. And so both of those can be on the table. A lot of cities are saying we want to revisit our accessory dwelling unit because we'd like to get more. Okay, some cities are saying that. So keep that in mind, and we'll hopefully give you enough information so you'll know which are things you have been working on and what kind of results you've been getting. And then on your affordability question, one of the first meetings will be data, and we have a chart that will show you for the way your comprehensive plan defines affordability, what that translates to for income and for different household size, and what that translates to how much you can afford for rent or ownership housing. So that is one of our base charts that you'll get almost immediately. Okay. All right.
And maybe this is a naive question, but as the reality of the mass transit takes shape in our region, how does that play into the sort of the regional perspective of this whole thing? In Sammamish, we have neither the transportation hub going in, nor do we have any of the big employers. So as these things happen in Issaquah and in Redmond, does the burden shift, or are there opportunities to collaborate more so that, if it makes more sense from, like on the ground reality, that there's more density in these places around those, either the employers or the transportation hubs, do we have an opportunity to change either the commitment we have or the way we participate in the region's growth?
So your housing goals are derived through an effort amongst all the public jurisdictions. The county, the cities, all get together and they're given a growth target that they're trying to achieve overall. In the last iteration, they did exactly what you're saying, is growth centers took a lot more of it, but there's still a responsibility for all communities to take some growth. So the exercise of how many units you have is that is part of the dynamic that goes on there. Now, how you plan your growth within your community, you have chosen to use a town center for a variety of different reasons. But I would say, there's every 5 years, there's more, you saw the charts about growth that's going on out there. But yes, part of the discussion has been about for different cities when they sit down with all of each other saying, and PSRC, the reference organization, has said they are trying to plan, I think is it half? Do you know what percentage? They're trying to plan, to have the plans add up that a very large percentage of the growth in the county or in the region is occurring in the designated centers. But that still doesn't mean there isn't growth in the other areas. So that is accounted for in looking at growth targets.
Okay, I guess where this is coming from, I'm just concerned that we are sitting here today trying to make plans for the future, and we obviously can't see the future, but we can sort of see where it's going. And I would hate to put the city in the predicament of building a bunch of affordable units that nobody wants because, as it turns out, everybody wants to live in Redmond so they can easily get on the
Right, and
train.
I think, well, I guess we can test that as buildings get built here, but there are people who work in your workforce in this community who have challenges, and this community we'll have data that maybe starts talking where you can talk about that more. Okay, so when we get to the data part, that'll be a good question to revisit and talk more about.
If I can add, one thing that I always like to say about planning and zoning and land use regulations is that we ultimately are framework builders. We build the regulatory framework, and the market drives what goes where. And I think that that's an important distinction, that the city is not a developer. The city is not going out building housing. We are building that framework, though. So that's another consideration, is that to kind of get at the point that you made, that if we're going to be building X amount of units in certain areas, what we're really doing is building that framework.
And I think you raise good points, and I think we'll have a whole evening where we talk about what do we mean by different income levels, and really what income is that. Moderate income is almost $80,000 a year. So there's a wide range of affordability needs that are defined. So it's home ownership, is it entry-level ownership, et cetera, and stuff like that. So it's a good point, and I think when we have data, it'll be a good time to talk about that more. Okay.
Are we actually on target to meet our targets, the 4,460 units with town center and all that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There's actually quite a bit that goes into the answer to that question. The way that I will
And if that's
answer
too
today.
much for tonight, we don't have to address it. I think that is something.
But
when you were asking about data, that is something that is probably on everybody's minds.
Yeah, we can definitely.
How
answer
are
that.
we?
That generally the communities in East King County are meeting their general growth targets for housing overall, but we'll have more specific data to come back with that.
I think that's something that's really important.
Okay.
I think it's time for a motion to
Oh, yeah.
extend the meeting
Go ahead.
to 11:45.
1:20 a.m.
This, Commissioner Crandall, this is my third night meeting of the week, so I'd appreciate a sooner.
I withdraw the motion. Let somebody.
Extend it to 9. Make a motion to.
I'm hearing rumors about 9,
Because we still have public comment.
and then we can do it again.
Right.
Okay. So 9 p.m. today.
Any second? for that?
Second.
Okay. There's a motion and a second to extend the meeting to 9 o'clock tonight. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed say no. Okay, we'll extend the meeting to 9 o'clock tonight.
And so these are really helpful questions, because you're actually jumping the gun on our end of the session question. So this is good, because you're taking your thoughts on your mind and giving them to us fresh as we go through. So you're sort of already you're starting the question part of the session right as we're doing the presentation. So I think that's really helpful, because we're seeing linkages and stuff. So should we jump to the second section, or second area of our effort? Okay.
I have
So-
2 more questions
Oh,
about,
okay.
these are just specific asks for data, and I see this all the time. It's, you hear about the changing preferences for younger generations, and I'm really interested to know what those are.
Okay.
I would like to add to that, if you're,
Go, yeah.
I get very tired of reading planning guidelines, and it's just a list of platitudes. And I loved it when the staff came in and said, we want to reflect the changing preferences amongst the younger generations. And I think that's so important, because we're in a time of change right now that's incredible. It's changing with transportation. When we think of mass transit, when we think of Uber, when we think of bicycles, when we think of walking, and when we think about the disdain that people have now for private cars. This is all new, just recently. When we think about retail, and we are seeing the demise of big box stores and giant chains as Amazon online is taking over. This is really going to influence housing. We see a lifestyle change as people prefer smaller living spaces and these tiny lots that just shock me, 4,000 square foot lots that we are allowing. I think they don't like the maintenance. I'm not sure what it is. But we have a new demographic. We are witnessing new groups of people with a recent explosion of the immigrant population, and they have a whole different idea about how they want to communicate and live. We have Central Washington University, who's come in, and now we're a college town, and that should really impact housing. So I looked online, and I wanted to find out planning strategies for this kind of thinking, and it was terrible. It was the same old platitudes, the same old stuff. And I want to know from Mr. Sullivan and staff, where can we read up on this and find out about it? I would like to know more, and I haven't been able to. And I frankly, I'm not seeing it in this material that we're getting right now. It seems to be missing that. There's a couple thoughts that I had. And I maybe this isn't a question, and I'm going to get bawled out here, but I'm going to take a chance. I was wondering if we could rebuild old neighborhoods without opening up new lands. I can't believe the number of letters I get from people who want to buy my house. Not that I'm willing to sell it, but it's out there. There's this pressure that's new. Are we able to bring in new enlivening uses into single-use neighborhoods through the new retail platform that doesn't involve a physical presence? Just think about that. I think that would be so exciting. That's a whole new way to think about it. It doesn't involve a physical presence. So you're not going to be mad that you're living next to McDonald's or Quicken Loans or something. You don't have to. It's online. And could representatives do it out of their houses for Amazon or for these different companies? There's things like that that I think immigrant populations might be interested in, especially immigrant populations. Why do I think that? Because I was at a social and health services presentation to council, and they were talking about that. And that coordination between this group, the housing group, and social and health services is crucial. I would love to see that. And then for years now, I have seen these designs, especially up in Vancouver, BC, where they really do a good job of it. They'll build a great big house. It doesn't look like the ones in these pictures. It'll be mixed use, but it'll have balconies and geraniums, and it'll look like a house. And it's in a single-family neighborhood, and it will have services in it for that house and for the neighborhood. Why can't we consider things like that? I think the opportunity is now, and I don't want to pass it up. I want us to be looking at things like that. So if you have information on it and can pass that on to us, I would love it. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, and you won't get bawled out. I completely agree with those things, all of them. Yeah, I mean, the younger generation, maybe they don't want garages, like you said, because they don't need cars.
What, Chair Collins, I actually am reminded of something, it has to do with this, the cars and the smaller houses. There's some interesting data, and I don't know whether it came out of this body or whether I heard it on the radio, but I think it was originated through from Microsoft and their connector bus. And who is using it and where those people are, where the trip originates, isn't here. They're coming out of the city. So I don't think we can assume that the people here want smaller houses and no cars. I think people are moving here because they want large houses and many cars, and that's part of the American dream. There's interesting data. I don't know if Microsoft will hand it over, but it's somewhere in the public domain that may actually inform this, so that we aren't making an assumption about who's trying to live here and what they want.
I think that's a really good comment.
I thought about this very early, and I still will write most of it up, but Commissioner Garrison just spurred me on to say this. There's a old Sonny and Cher song about pave another parking lot, build another parking lot. I'm sitting here, I want to be positive. I think we need to have a big thought somewhere and do something large. Can we think about, no answer needed, tearing up parking lots and putting in the Terrytown types of New York that's back? They built these ahead of time, considering what the World War II would happen and all that. Maybe set rates, what those units would cost, and at the same time put a cap on them, that like they do rentals in New York City. I don't need an answer, but it's just falling around. Who will move here, and how do we encourage or discourage who moves here?
So your comment is interesting. I believe Sonny and Cher might have sang it, but so did Joni Mitchell.
Yes.
And the only reason I remember this so vividly is, are any of you familiar with the South Kirkland Park and Ride lot? Which has now got housing on half of it. The city council member who was totally behind that was trying to get Joni Mitchell to come to the opening to sing the song, because she said, we tore up a parking lot and built paradise instead of the other way around. So your point actually has local roots to some. We have done some of that, or at least, that has happened. I'm loving these comments, and as you're making your comments, I am trying to take notes on, some of this sounds like some of our outreach, people we need to talk to. I've heard get to human services people, so we're linking housing. I've heard the immigrant population. I'm also hearing some about data. So if you have more to add, also add in the flavor of what's the data, and we're kind of jumping around in the presentation right now because I'm liking your comments and they're very helpful. So if others want to add their own perspectives here, also keep in mind as you're making your comments, and this is the kind of stuff that might help forward this thought I have on my mind, either from a data who we need to reach out to.
Right, on a data thing, do we have an assessment of kind of the levels of housing that are here? How much medium income housing that we currently have?
Yes.
That's
Yes,
part of the deal?
that's part of the data part we'll have for you.
Right, okay, all right, thank you.
I think in terms of outreach, it'd be really interesting to get a stakeholder group together of realtors. I want to hear, what do people want when they come to Sammamish looking for housing and they get a realtor? What are the realtors hearing that they want? Do they want smaller housing, bigger housing? What is it? I think that would be really helpful.
Okay.
I think I'll leave it at that for now.
I would add homeowners associations for outreach. Some policy considerations, some regulations may conflict with some neighborhood character within a homeowners association or their CC&Rs.
Mm-hmm. Could you say a little more about that?
A CC&R may specifically restrict certain uses of the property, certain setbacks.
Right.
That are more stringent than your city code is.
And what's the discussion topic there? I mean, I'm curious because I understand what you're talking about, and I'm trying to see how that translates, how we would try to do some work around that, or what this discussion
I think
is.
it's going back to what's been said by other commissioners, which is a realistic picture of what's out there, not a preconceived opinion formed because of our own view on the next generation, something that gives more data potentially.
Okay.
If even just on the street conversations, similar to the pro plan.
Okay.
Right, and maybe even data from outside of this region. You were talking about New York City or whatever. I mean, maybe it'd be interesting to know what other regions in the United States are doing that have
In terms of
similar-
action, I mean, things they're doing housing-wise?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Not to expand your scope, but it might
Like
be
other
interesting.
expensive suburbs.
Right,
Like, that's
San
kinda what I'm
Francisco,
thinking, yeah.
Silicon Valley, what are these other places that are kind of similar markets and things? How are they handling that, or are they handling it
Right.
at all?
And I can sort of let you know from doing this for 25 years here and 35 years in total plus, and I've been for the last 2 years part of a work group of housing professionals, focusing on affordable housing, but housing professionals from all over the country. So I'm dealing with other senior housing staff and what they are trying to do in other regions. And I listen to what they're talking about, and then I show them the slide presentation of what the cities over here are doing. And they're like going, wow, you're doing more than you're seeing between the cities collectively, you have a lot of the issues on the tables that people are thinking about. Now, I've heard you say some things, which is really interesting tonight, especially Commissioner Garrison's comment, that is sort of a bolder way of even stating it from a bigger picture point of view. Interestingly enough, we're hearing a very similar conversation in Kirkland right now about this boldness of thinking of the future and thinking about how do we mix our uses more, and is that okay to do because of where, So I would say, yes, I've been talking to people for 2 years. I've been to many different parts of the country, touring what other areas are doing. We've taken groups up to Vancouver in the past, and so we have a pretty good feel. But what I think I can let you know is, while that's useful to do, we have plenty of examples locally as well that you can see that's being done. But there's always still more we can look for outside the area as well. And that's what we'll bring to you, is very real experiences nearby, but we'll also supplement that with things that are going on elsewhere. But you'd be surprised that generally there's a lot of ideas locally.
Right, well, like Jane Jacobs' book, you probably read it, Eyes on the Street, right? And that speaks to this nature of how it used to be. You had these kind of, the butcher had his butcher shop down here and he lived above it. And so the kids played out in the street, and there was always eyes on the street. So there wasn't need for policing. If someone stranger came into the neighborhood and tried to mess with a kid, next thing you know, the butcher's out there with his cleaver and the guy runs off, right? So this is way better than police, so, yeah, right.
Okay.
I had a thought about community outreach and about stakeholders when I think about special needs housing. From what I'm just looking there, when they talk about special needs housing, it's about senior housing, that type of thing. But I personally, I think about special needs adults and housing. There's an organization in Issaquah called Leo, and they have I would say, an abundance of information on that particular topic. They build houses, single family home house, which house 4 or 5 special needs adults. So I think, and maybe ARC of King County would be another organization to consult about housing for special needs adults, and kind of getting some input from them.
Okay. And we've worked with them in the past. The
Wonderful.
cities have helped fund a number of properties, them and a couple other groups. So we can.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
This is great because we all say something and it triggers something else. This one. Age in place is a big kind of trend now, where it's called age in place housing, and it's essentially allows one to, most of the time people get driven out of their house as they age due to the fact that the house isn't built on one level or whatever, and people do better when they're in their houses. And so I think that if we could somehow influence that component and allow people to stay in their house longer, perhaps.
So one question on this front that we'll have for you is, you're about how many cities have we started these with? About the 6? You're about the 6th city we've been doing this. We have done a number of stakeholders meetings, and so a question that we might bring back at the next meeting is that we've talked to like 3 senior groups in East King County, and the points you're raising, and we haven't talked specifically to the adult, the adult individual with special needs. And so one of the things I might want to sort of put by you is, if we share you the notes, I think local realtors would be good to do. We did that in Kirkland. But there may be some groups where we can share you the stakeholder results from other cities that are on the east side. Because what we found is, one of the reasons ARCH was formed is we said there's a lot of similarity between cities. You're going to see that with the data. We have found that instead of maybe finding, what can we supplement the ones we've already done that are most particular to Sammamish, so that if we do 3 or 4, we focus on some, but you can take advantage of some of the stakeholders groups that we've done for other groups on the east side, who are generally, we think, they find they're serving very similar needs as yours. And that would allow us to get even more for you, because you can read the other stuff, but then we can do some very specialized stakeholder groups for you. And we'll look at these notes to sort of propose a mixture of that, if that's okay for us to sort of look at it that way.
That makes sense to me. I think that's good. Okay. As long as they're similar.
Right. And I'd only offer it if I hadn't gone through 3 in other cities and we okay, got it, we're hearing it, and just hearing your comments and conversations we're hearing. So, but I am hearing wrinkles that are a little different that we should make sure we supplement that with.
Another question I have, and I don't even know if this is an issue, but I hear about it on the radio sometimes. I read about it in the New York Times. Do we have an issue with temporary housing? Airbnb, VRBO. Do we have an issue with those properties, driving up costs because we don't have permanent folks living in those houses? And then also, what about vacant homes that are owned by investors? Is that an issue in our community? I guess that's some data that I'm interested in if you don't know the answer.
Yeah, I think that data might be a little bit hard to get. However, I will say we have heard a little bit in regard to, for instance, short-term rentals. We've started to hear a little bit of talk about it. Nothing that has been
big.
In any sort of critical mass. We do not have any short-term rental regulations, as other cities are talking about. Seattle actually is talking
Seattle
about
just
that,
did it.
right, recently. So I guess the answer to that is that it's kind of undefined at this point. We know that there's some level of that. However, we don't haven't.
It doesn't sound like it's an issue.
So and here's more food for thought for you. And this is maybe one advantage of being part of this collective group, is you have the same staff working in other cities, is that we had another city that said, well, maybe this is an issue for us, but it's probably an issue for that city in particular. And we say, you're right, they're looking at it, like Kirkland is looking at this issue right now. That maybe you go, okay, we know one of our neighbors is working on it, let them cut their teeth on it. So we'll make it a medium priority, which is sort of a way of saying it's important, but let's let another city grapple with it and let them be our learning curve, and we'll sort of follow when they're done and look at it. So that's another thing, when you're trying to sort through a lot of stuff, to some extent, take advantage of what your neighbors are doing and saying, let them be the one that I think came up in Kenmore was, there's this whole issue about using new types of wood, engineered wood. So it's a very technical issue and stuff like that. But yet the building industry is saying this could be pretty important. Well, Kenmore said, we're a small city. We know that this is probably being looked at in Bellevue, so we'll revisit that one in a few years and see where they land, and let them be the ones with all the expertise they have. So that's something to think about when you start filtering, and we can maybe let you know if we know other cities are working on something and stuff. So sometimes you may find we want to work on the same thing as other cities, so we can all work on it together and learn from each other. Others you may say, we're not sure it's real important to us right now, but we know we can watch somebody else.
Planners are very good at sharing and also stealing ideas from each other. So,
other general thoughts, and then I'm going to go through my other couple sections quicker because we're doing the more important stuff right now, which is getting your input on what's going to help you as we move forward. And these slides were meant just to sort of help prime the pump, but you're doing pretty well without seeing all the slides. And when you see some more, that might pump a few more. But before I go on, I want to make sure anyone has any other thoughts on the top of their mind right now. Okay?
I do have one more thing.
Okay.
And it's something I've been thinking about lately because, we've had a lot of meetings that talk about, R1 and upzoning to R4. And it's just these really heated discussions about how we provide more housing in Sammamish. And, it occurred to me that some of the trouble that we're dealing with is that people are afraid of development because they're afraid of the lack of quality and a lot of times the lack of integration in the neighborhood. And I was looking at all the policies, and the policies say that, we're supposed to support quality and we need to support neighborhood character and allow new developments to fit well into those areas. And so I'm wondering if we can think about other routes to making the community more comfortable with growth, which would be improving the quality of design. We talked about buffers, a few months ago, and Commissioner Brooks brought this up the other night. Maybe we need to revisit sort of the landscape standards that we talked about. Things like this might make growth and making these different types of housing more tenable to the community if we can sort of improve the way that they're implemented.
When we are talking that section, we should have some more conversation around that topic and some of the pros and cons and the challenges and what then, how do you frame it? And again, remember, we're not here to come to the solution on that. But is that topic so important we should prioritize and have this community have a harder conversation? And so the key is to get you to a point to say, yeah, this is something that's important enough that we should try to figure out a way to frame a conversation on that.
And that's a great point. I would just add that I think Chair Collins, what you're hitting on is that growth and development it's very complex and it's very dynamic in many ways. And so the solution may be out there. The path to get to it might be part of the housing strategy plan. And I think the Planning Commission should be thinking about that. However, I do want to just continue to emphasize that we want to make sure we answer the question at hand too. So these are great conversations, and they might relate to the housing strategy plan, and then also future code amendments or future policy efforts as well. So these are really broad, complex issues that we can get at in multiple ways. So thank you.
I have one final thing to say. Can I squeeze it in? Okay, so I've been trying to avoid talking about this because it's somewhat inappropriate and it's like super future thinking. But I would, as we're talking about housing strategy, I can't get away from the zoning map. And we've seen these maps where we have this super granular future map that is the same thing as our current map, and it makes absolutely no sense. And I would support an eventual conversation around adopting what I think is a smarter way of approaching the whole zoning and the future map thing, of like what Redmond does, where there's a big color blobs on the map that are sort of aspirational, and then we let the granular stuff happen at a different level. Because when Chair Collins was talking about people being afraid of this development thing, I mean, everything seems so tight. And, I have my own opinions on how the city should develop and what it should look like. But it doesn't make any sense for us to have this iron grip on it if in fact, we do have to accept the fact that we're growing and we're going to be part of a region that is growing. So next time that comes up, I vote for changing the map.
Good point.
That's a really great comment. Thank you for making that. I think that kind of in the same vein of the response I gave to Chair Collins, I think that these are related and much deeper than the effort we're looking at now. And I think that is actually a really good point that to make when we start on our comprehensive plan update. It's due in 2023, which means we'll probably start on it like tomorrow. So. That's a great point. That's the ultimate real where the rubber meets the road with regard to where development goes. So thank you.
I know we only have 5 more minutes, and I know we do have someone from the public that wants to speak tonight. So how do you guys want to proceed?
If I could take just 2 minutes to go through just the other sections real quick, just to give you a sense of them.
Yeah, go
And then
for it.
if you have, because I think right after those, we were going to come to your questions. So just very quickly, hit on the second section, which is basically where cities are using land use incentives. So when they change their zoning, and increase capacity, they linked affordability to that. And you've done that in your town center. And what we're just showing you here is when you look at East King County as a whole, more and more cities are using that tool. And what this graphic is showing you is, and more, we're now seeing the results of those plans that were put in place 5 to 10 years ago. This graph just shows you how many more units we're getting a year than we got in the past through land use incentive programs, including Sammamish, where 3 projects in the town center have affordable units. So that's one main strategy in the second area. Next slide. And again, this is your town center plan, so I'll just go back to that. We'll talk about it more in the future. And then the other, so that's the second area, is where you use land use incentives where it's still the market building it, but they're going to give you some explicit affordability with it, okay? We also put 80 accessory dwelling units kind of in that category because it's just considered an affordable product. Under direct assistance, this is, go back one slide. This is where cities do funding is one primary area. And your city, and this is one of the things that's unique about this region, your comment about where should the affordable housing go, you help fund affordable housing throughout East King County, and you get some credit for doing that. So, and some of it may land in your community. Your council said, hey, in town center someday, we'd like to see something that's getting funding assistance like you see in the Y Family Village in Issaquah Highlands. So you've been doing that through general funds, but other ways you've done it is land, so the next slide. Is often there is underutilized land. So this is your comment about the parking lot, where here is the South Kirkland Park and Ride, and that is on an active park and ride lot that actually expanded their park and ride capacity at the same time they added all that housing that you see there on the same parcel of land by adding a parking structure in the back of the site. And another site is much smaller scale, as sometimes cities have smaller parcels. You have the Habitat homes that you're doing. There was a small facility for homeless that was done in Bellevue on a small surplus piece of land. So utilizing land that is publicly owned, or another way that we're increasingly seeing things like this done, which may be applied, next slide, is faith-based properties, where you take a portion of a church property and you put some housing on it. And one example is senior housing, and this was built in a neighborhood where the church saw seniors wanting to age in place in their neighborhood. And so they built, these are all duplexes and triplexes. They're not single family homes, but it's a single family neighborhood. And they just built it on the back of their church property. And it's for lower income seniors so they could stay in the community. Another one is a Habitat project in the middle on a small piece of church property. And then the other is a much larger scale piece of church property where we're building a 3-story building with underground parking because it's on a main arterial. And so the church is still there, you can see in the foreground. So there is examples of where properties are continuing their existing use, but are finding ways to incorporate more diverse housing and more affordable housing. And often that land is done at a discount. Next slide. Special needs housing, so you brought that up. We've helped young adults, we've helped as group homes, that you can see a picture here where we help people buy existing homes, and or help Leo House, they've built a couple homes. So that sometimes we're serving very specialized populations with a direct assistance, where we are targeting very specialized needs in the community, or groups who are targeting those needs, and we support them. Next slide. Homeless housing. So we've done a variety of different types, different scales. If you ever go down Avondale Road, if you've been around long enough, you've heard of the old Coast Guard site. That's what it's referred to if you've been around a long time. And that was surplus land. Another example in Kirkland where someone just bought a small 4-plex and they're able to buy that and then serve homeless households. So that's another population group that the direct assistance has been assisting, both through land and cash from cities. And our resources from cities are only a small portion. The rest comes from other public funding sources at the state and federal level, the county level, and also comes from private, like fundraising. Leo House gets a lot of private funds to support the houses they do. Next slide. And this is just another example, and this it illustrates the wide range of funding sources that individual projects typically use. Often the groups that are putting these developments together are using 5 or 6 different funding sources. We'll talk about that more in another meeting. Next slide. Again, senior housing, I showed you the one picture. We actually helped another group buy an old assisted living with services building that was going to be torn down because the market's moved on. And we helped the group buy it, and now it's lower cost housing with services for seniors in that building. One of the few in the state that are structured that way. Affordable housing with services. Next slide. We've done family rental housing. One of these, the Kalani, that's now in the city of Sammamish. That was done a number of years ago. So we serve families. Next slide. Sometimes we're helping preserve existing. Existing housing's getting expensive, right? Well, if you buy an existing building, maybe you can keep it more affordable. So we've helped a number of groups buy existing properties. Next slide. And sometimes those are properties that receive federal assistance. And the owner is a private owner who might convert that to market rate housing. A top priority in our region has been to not lose that federally assisted housing. So we help a group buy out the private owner and keep that housing affordable that's been in the community. Next slide. And then we've done some ownership. This is a project in Newcastle. You're working on a very similar type of project that's being done by Habitat with cottages just down the street here. Next slide. And then sometimes what we do is cities actually combine all 3 of those general categories to help make the housing happen. That there's not enough money out there, so can we combine the land use incentives with allowing more diverse forms of housing with the direct assistance to get, and so sometimes we actually find cities are doing all of those things together. And I think that takes, next slide. So now we're just going back to reminding you those are the 3 areas. We've just tried to do a really quick overview. We'll have more time in the future meetings to go through those in more detail, but we wanted to just give you sort of the quick run through of the range of types of things that cities have been doing. Okay?
And then again, and then again, just to kind of lead into our final discussion here for tonight is reiterating that it's our prioritized work program for housing. It's not an action plan. And then the point that Planning Commission is going to be making difficult decisions on this. So it's not easy. It's not meant to be easy, but it is going to be a pretty in-depth policy conversation, and I think that's going to be good for our commission and for the city. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to interrupt. We need to extend our meeting once again.
Can I have a motion?
I move that we extend the meeting to 9:15.
Second.
All those there's a motion and a second to extend the meeting to 9:15. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed say no. Okay, it's unanimous. We'll go to 9:15, but I'm hoping we'll just wrap this up.
It's pretty close. Yeah.
We done?
Yeah. So we mentioned at the beginning that these are the 2 key questions we want a Planning Commission to consider. You guys have pretty sufficiently answered, I think, both of them. For the purposes of discussion tonight, I think we can probably say that that's sufficiently answered. But please feel free, call, email. I'm available. I would be more than happy to talk further about this if you have specific ideas, and we can log those. Our next meeting is going to be in January. I think, I apologize, I don't have the exact date. I think it's January 18th. I'll double check that though. But this is the first work session, and we're going to have plenty more. So.
Well, thank you guys.
And I would just say the comments you were making throughout are perfect. So more thoughts like that, feed them to us, and we'll try to sort those out into these 2 questions here. And then we'll come back with a range of information to make sure we've got the right stuff.
One last question, Doug. Is there a way that you can tell us what type of data on housing that City of Sammamish tracks? For example,
right.
Existing housing.
So the quick answer is go to the website and look at the housing needs analysis, which is a lot of data.
Okay. All right.
So that's part of your homework assignment.
Okay.
Start reading
All
that.
right. Thank you.
Yes, that's on your website.
Yes, yeah. And again, as it relates to outreach, be prepared. Planning Commission will be asked to engage in a little bit of an additional effort for the outreach portion. We do want you, as the commission, to be leading this, be community leaders out there, if that's with your associated agencies or even homeowners associations or friends, schools, family, et cetera. We want Planning Commission to have a sense of ownership over that outreach process, so be prepared.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to public comment. So this is the public comment section that is for agenda-related items. So I will start with Corinne Lee. Is that you? Okay.
Yay. My name is Karen Lee. I live at 582 240th Avenue Southeast, Sammamish. And I'm on the Preserve Providence Heights campus new nonprofit organization that we just formed about 3 weeks ago. We're filing for a 401c3 status. And I can't believe, I'm so excited. We just found out tonight that we filed a motion to intervene into the lawsuit between the City of Issaquah and City Church, now called Church Home, because we didn't feel that the City of Issaquah really thought through what they were doing, because they pretty much ran over their own historical preservations grant that they had given to Providence Heights campus. That is a historical site. It's a landmark. It's a Issaquah landmark, and they just kind of threw it under the bus. So we're intervening on behalf of Providence Heights, and it's 40 acres of forest, trails, buildings, 180 dorms and apartments, plus apartments that could be used to house homeless or low income or, school teachers and people who work in our cities, Issaquah and Sammamish. And what I would love to see happen is to find a way actually right now, the land is still for sale. So City Church wants to sell the land. The school board has put on hold their eminent domain it's not a threat, but it's a desire, I guess. They put it on hold, but we're not sure why. But so the land is still for sale, and we have a veterans group that has made offers on the land to buy it, but Church Home has not actually even looked at they haven't responded to their request to buy the land. So the land is still for sale. It has a beautiful church. Well, of course, you've been there because it used to be the YMCA, but it has the bomb shelter. It has the church building that could be used for concerts. I guess Sammamish Symphony is looking for a place to have their rehearsals and their concerts. It would be nice, to listen to them. That's not a school cafeteria, but in a place that has great acoustics. And that chapel, I've been in that chapel for church services, and it has beautiful acoustics. And we could have dance performances in there, art shows. People could rent it for all kinds of events. We have 2 garden clubs in Sammamish and 1 in Issaquah that we would love to get our hands on some land that we could put in some gardens, some public gardens, because that's one of the big things that our garden clubs, one of our service projects that we do is public gardens, but right now, we already did everything in Issaquah, so we have nothing left to do. And the Sammamish garden clubs, are looking for places too to put in public gardens. We were in charge of 1 garden at the Bellevue Botanical Garden, but now that one's done. So anyway, I know I'm getting nervous. We would like to see somehow a way for Issaquah and Sammamish and the Veterans Group and public housing and services to get together and form some kind of a coalition to work on using this preserve the campus to be used for our communities and not tear it down. If the school district gets it, they have proposed a zero-lot zoning for it, so they would tear down literally every single tree on that 40 acres, and they will build to the very edge of the property. So we don't want to see that happen, really. We would like to have it preserved for, our communities, and so that we can use those buildings, for our communities, our citizens, people who need it, and keep the land that's there, or keep the nature that's there, and preserve the animals that are there, prevent erosion. Actually, and the thing is that they've already started demolition. They started it this week. The first thing they have to do is to take out anything that has, what was that word? What is the stuff that's in the ceilings that they have to take out? Asbestos, yeah. But right now, they have to fix. I don't know how close you're working with Issaquah, but I think Providence Heights campus has their own water well, and City Church turned off the pipes several years ago when they stopped using the facilities, so the water didn't come on right away when they turned it on. So they have to fix the pipes or something so that they can have running water so they can do the asbestos removal. But demolition, the bulldozers are supposed to come in on January 2nd. So City Church wants to bulldoze the property no matter if they have a buyer or not. And we want to prevent that from happening. So somehow, if you can give me an idea of how we can get this done, how Issaquah and Sammamish together can get this done, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Karen, actually, can you state your address for the record?
Oh, it's on the paper, 582
Yes,
Avenue Southeast.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone else who'd like to speak tonight? Mr. Stickney? Oh, do we have to? Do we have to do that?
Hey, Kelly, do you have the slide up?
Yes, it is. It's on the.
Let me ask Kelly if we have to. Kelly, do we have to extend the meeting, or is it obvious that we're going to? Okay. All right, I make a motion to extend the meeting to 9:30.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to extend the meeting to 9:30. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed say no? Okay, meeting's extended to 9:30.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. My name, Paul Stickney at 504 228th Ave Southeast. Much good comments tonight. Kudos to staff, Arch, and Planning Commission. Super good topics talked about. What I'm going to present tonight is not the same old stuff. This presentation is about changing housing policies in Sammamish. So put on the seatbelt. Here we go. And to get the most out of my presentation, you have a copy of this that's been sent to you, but it's a lot of information, but it's really distilled. And if you really study this, most of what you've talked about tonight is in Common Cause housing balance. This evening, I'm presenting this to you because of the timing of the housing strategy plan. The council has this, but they don't have this presentation that I'm going to show you this evening, which I will be giving to the city council. And I'm going to be encouraging the city to want to change the housing element for the long-term best interests of our entire community. 5 things off the bat. Internal housing balance is definitely perceptively outside of the box, yet it is genuine and very powerful for our city. Housing balance isn't about the external growth target, has nothing to do with that. It's about internal economic and demographic needs over recurring cycles of life, which are totally different numbers than our external growth target, and a truth which is contentious, however, it's a fact. Our internal out of balance cycle of life numbers to meet economic and demographic needs for all of our residents over a cycle of life is a far larger number than our growth target, and that's the rub. So let's start the presentation. Let's go to the second slide, please. I am suggesting that the city pause the housing strategy plan, pause the future portion of the transportation master plan, continue to work on past and present transportation issues, and resolve to amend comp plan housing policies. Common Cause has two land use changes at its core. To basically positively decrease the number of large single-family homes that are zoned for citywide, and to positively increase the number of smaller and different homes in centers. All the positives outlined in this book. Next slide. Presently in Sammamish, we are facing issues: traffic, trees, housing affordability, and community character. Next slide. However, those issues, traffic, trees, and housing and character, are symptoms. They're symptoms of two major ailments. Next slide, please. The major ailments are residential housing policies and capital spending choices since we have become a city. Next slide. These two major ailments are, and this is very important, are both temporal in nature. They go past, they're today, and they go way into the future. To remedy these two major ailments, holistic temporal solutions must be utilized. Next slide. Changing residential housing policies is the foremost positive temporal solution for Sammamish. The overall benefits to our community to lessen large single-family homes because we have an oversupply internally, and to increase smaller units in our centers is extraordinary. Next slide. There are 7 equally important platforms and principal foundations that affect and influence housing and what I call housing balance in Sammamish over time. Next. The first we all know, and it's one of the most important: character. Next slide. The natural environment is a huge part of housing policy. Commissioner Garrison and many others have talked about this, and absolutely correct. Next slide. Public built environment. That's traffic and roads. We own those. That's trails, non-motorized, parks and recreation, civic building, transit, all public built. Next slide. State, regional, county, and local policies, from the GMA down to our comprehensive plan. The next slide. The next two major principles is external market demand, I'll stutter on the D, and private property rights. Who wants to guess what's missing? Next slide, please. Internal. We have not planned as a community for internal. We have anecdotally, we discuss it, but we don't have a comprehensive needs analysis or survey to know all of our numbers and all of our gaps for housing affordability for our city for all groups. Now I'm going to give you 2 examples of 2 perspectives. Next slide, please. We have about 23,000 homes in the city, with 1,000 more in the pipeline. About 22,000 of those are single family, 2,000 are multifamily. We have about 4,000 jobs in our city. The town center plans for 2,000 units. Next slide. So relative to 22,000 single family homes today and 4,000 workforce jobs today, is 4,000 multifamily units in the optimal range? No, it's way low. Look at topics, or at tabs 7 and 9 in the Housing Balance book for comprehensive proof on this, and meeting those needs will be beneficial for our city. Next slide. Looking at the future. Don't have time to go through all this, but it's in your packet. Let's go to the next slide and ask the question. Relative to an end game of roughly 26,000 single-family homes and 6,000 workforce jobs, is the 4,000 multifamily units we have planned for within the optimal range? The answer is no. The next slide. So, summarizing, going to restate, would like to pause the housing strategy plan, the future transportation plan, optimize homes in the city, then pick up the housing plan and future transportation plan. Next slide. In tab 5 of Common Cause, there are over 40 positive decreases and positive increases that holistically create immense benefits for our community, enrich the lives of those living and working here, and will establish enduring character consensus over time. I'll be sending you some specifics over the next week or so for you to consider if you want to ask staff for certain parts of data because of the information I send. But my goal is for the city to, and I'm almost done, have a significant and notable decrease in single-family homes, increase multifamily homes, and reduce traffic and transportation, create wealth, lessen issues, and improve overall city character. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. Okay, if there are no other speakers, is there anyone else who'd like to speak tonight? Okay. I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And that's unanimous. We're adjourning the meeting at 9:21. Thank you, everybody.